Hello, this is Dan Niswander. What is democratic socialism? Why is this so important in understanding the history of social and economic injustice? What is socialism? Why do we define systems using words that end with ism? What is the New Deal from the 20th century? What is an economic Bill of Rights for the 21st century? These are some very important questions that I will be analyzing in this special report, What is Democratic Socialism and an Economic Bill of Rights?
Let's all try to put the pieces back together again.
I think all of you know that today we don't have liberty and justice for all. We have one system of justice for the crooks on Wall Street whose greed and illegal behavior almost destroyed our entire economy and resulted in millions of people losing their jobs and their homes and their life savings. And somebody correct me here, but I don't recall that one of those crooks went to jail. That's right. But then we have a different system of justice for a kid who smokes marijuana or another kid who steals a pair of sneakers. We have one system of justice if you are white, and another system of justice if you are black or brown or Native American.
We need a Teddy Roosevelt to split up the big antitrusts. We need to do that again. And we need to get money out of politics. So that's the way people always say, well, Jimmy, what's your solution to fix all this? You got to break up the big corporations, and then I mean, we're bombing again. We've been nonstop bombing. And you know, they tell us that we're supposed to be afraid of the Muslims because it's their religion that makes them crazy killers, right?
That's right.
Although there's millions of Muslims living in America and they're not killing us ever.
That's
Maybe it's because we're bombing. You know, if we found out there was oil in Salt Lake City and we started bombing it for 30 years straight, there'd be a lot of Mormon terrorists.
That's right. And we'd find, oh my gosh, there's not oil here. There's only salt.
So that's the problem. We always have bomb money, but we're firing teachers, right? As soon as the economy crashes, they fire teachers because that's what gets you out of a depression, dumber kids, right, Dan? That's what really...
Well, you know, and there's also this discussion about socialism, is that most people don't even understand what it means. You know, they think, okay, there's National Socialism, okay? It exists in Scandinavia, okay? It exists in Germany, exists in where my family's from, in Switzerland. Okay, in the 21st century, yes, it was National Socialism in the 1930s in Italy and in Germany. But they were fascist dictators.
They were fascists, yes.
You know, that's a different thing. And also this thing with capitalism as well. You know, when people say, but more people have been moved out of poverty because of capitalism more than any other system in history. And I'm thinking, that expression, you know, lifting the boats, okay, that's
rising
another
tide
thing.
does not raise all boats.
But when that did happen to some extent, that was in the past.
That's
we are
right.
now in the 21st century. Capitalism is failing.
Right.
We need to change this.
Well, because first of all, people don't realize that there is no such thing as a free market. There's just markets that we invent, and then we regulate them heavily. And the people with the most money get to rig those economies, those markets, in their favor, which is why when we have a booming economy, all the profits that the workers generate, all those profits go to the upper 1% instead of the people who are actually generating those profits. That's called a broken economy. That's what Marx actually warned people against
Yes.
about capitalism, that capitalism eats itself. And if we don't regulate it like FDR did, it will eat itself. But if you have good regulations on it, which is so that's the thing too. Bernie Sanders needs to stop saying he's not a capitalist. He needs to say, I'm a socialist, and if you're for Social Security, you are too. Everybody's for Social Security. Everybody's for Medicare. Everybody's for the fire department and the police department and libraries
That's right.
and roads and bridges and national parks. And that's what he says, that's socialism. So he's got to make people less scared of it.
The history of socialism in this country is not so different from the history elsewhere. Basically, since capitalism arose as a system and it came to the United States with the colonists who took over this country from the Native Americans, capitalism has been the way that the system organized itself, employers and employees. And like all systems, capitalism in the United States and elsewhere has had the people who love it and the people who don't, the people who think it's a great achievement and the people who think we can and should do better. The folks who think we can and should do better, over time, adopted a name for themselves, and the name was socialists. Their idea was capitalism is a system set up for a minority of people, the few who own the factories, the offices, the stores, who are in a position to decide what gets produced and what gets done with the profits. And they run the system to benefit themselves. And the critics said, yeah, but that's the problem. The system benefits you because you run it, but we, who are the majority, and in whose name a revolution in America against Britain was run, we are being left out. So we want the whole society to benefit, not just you, and so they took the name socialists. They did it in Europe, they did it here. And so the irony of it is that socialism is capitalism's shadow. You can't get rid of your shadow, and capitalism can never get rid of socialism, because socialism is the name for the people who are critics. And you can imagine that the system will one day be so wonderful that it will have no critics. But that's never happened in the history of the human race, and it's really a long shot this time. So socialists have been up and down. They've been big, with lots of people thinking it. Other times they've been small. What you can say is the idea that you could get beyond it, that you could live in a capitalism that had no socialism, that's we've never seen. And the irony of ironies is that now, after a Cold War period since Second World War, when it was almost taboo to say socialism, here it comes once again, proving itself always there as it comes roaring back, first in the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011, and now in the candidacy of Bernie Sanders, as if to tell the world, I told you so, socialism isn't going away, you haven't erased it, because it's the shadow, it's the criticism. And eventually, my guess is that the critics will so outnumber the defenders that the system will dissolve. Because I think that's what happened in the Soviet Union in 1989, that the critics were so numerous, were so determined, that it just fell apart. It was a dissolution, and the notion that it can only happen there and can't happen here is the worst kind of wishful thinking.
I'm an organizer with the Democratic Socialists of America. So we are a multi-tenancy organization. We're a nonprofit organization. We're not a political party. We're a multi-tendency organization.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
So what that means is that we absolutely do think that electoral politics are important. We want more people to get engaged, like Kenneth, who are going ahead and saying, okay, we're tired of the way this works. We want to bring an alternative to politics outside the regular conservative liberal. But also the idea that we have to be engaged with actual activism, with pressuring politicians outside of elections, and actually building real education around ideology. So we're putting forward something that's different from regular neoliberalism or conservatism, something that's actually truly progressive.
You just keep doing it. It sends a real message, I think, that people are in the streets, because it's the only other way to get your voice heard if you don't play the game the way it's been played, with lobbyists, congressmen who are too much influenced by lobbyists, corporate money that influences the politicians. This is really the only alternative, so don't let them convince you to come inside, put on a suit, and hire a lobbyist. That's how you lose. This is how you win. So my congratulations to you. All modern societies that work, I'm thinking of governments in Europe that function more smoothly than ours, that take care of their citizens, they're a hybrid of capitalism and socialism. Obviously, America is also. We are full of socialist entities in this country. Even the tea baggers don't want to get rid of Social Security. They want their Medicare. They want their farm subsidies. They want their mortgages through the government. The bankers, they certainly take more handouts than anybody. But it has to be done in a fair way, and it has to be done in a way that works for everybody.
I know we're streaming live right now, so I'm talking to folk right now who are not here. Folk who are not here right now, but know that they're catching hell. Know that they can't find a job. Know that they can't afford their student loans. Know that they're living back home with their mom and them. Know that they don't have access to health care, etc., etc., etc. If you have a legitimate grievance, this is where you need to be. And I'm convinced that if we keep making enough noise, somebody's got to start asking questions about what does matter to us. The worst thing you can do to a human being is to make him or her feel invisible, to make them feel disposable, to make them feel like they're a calculation or they are an afterthought. And there's too much of that in this country. The humanity of too many people is being contested every day. What we are fighting against is the contestation of the humanity of too many Americans of all races, colors, creeds, etc.
What is democratic socialism? Senator and presidential candidate Bernie Sanders gave us a remarkable speech on this subject in June of 2019, and I will analyze that later in this special presentation. First, what is socialism? There are numerous ways to analyze just this one word, just like there would be numerous ways to analyze any system in any society at any time of history, including feudalism that dominated before capitalism, and of course, capitalism. Historically, it is important to understand that socialism has never dominated the modern world, yet capitalism has and continues to be in the 21st century. I'll leave it at that for now. Let's look at just a few definitions of socialism to start. I'll have an interesting example of a different way to organize an economy as well as society later on in this special presentation. First of all, socialism is described as a political and economic theory of social organization which advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. Second, it is a policy or practice based on the political and economic theory of socialism. Third, some look at it through Marxist theory as a transitional social state between the overthrow of capitalism and the realization of communism. Karl Marx, the author of Das Kapital, or in English, Capital, was a 19th century intellectual who is still considered the most well-known international critic of capitalism. Based on history books in our schools for decades, and also the red baiting originated from individuals such as Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin in the 1950s, many people in the United States learned to only associate socialism as well as communism, which is one of the many forms of socialism, with authoritarian dictators in places like 20th century Europe and the U.S.S.R, Union of Socialist Soviet Republic, which included Russia. One could say that two huge socialist experiments have happened in Asia. The U.S.S.R technically failed to survive, and China is still ongoing. Both models in 21st century China and Russia have had extraordinary economic success stories. Both technically are now predominantly capitalist, actually, as far as the economics is concerned. In 1917 Russia, there was a revolution when it was a humongous landmass governed by Tsar Nicholas II and the Romanov family, which was essentially a feudal system with lords and serfs. After the end of feudalism around the world, there was also a world war in which Russia lost. A little footnote, the U.S. was one of the countries that invaded Russia in World War I, and Russia has never invaded the U.S. A wing of the Social Democratic Party, made up of what were called Bolsheviks, and the Socialist Revolutionary Party, which consisted of peasants, came together inspired by the ideas and the writings of Karl Marx. They created a successful revolution that was tired of the inequality of both late-stage feudalism, still happening in their country, and the new dominant system of capitalism. There were socialists who supported one idea and socialists that supported another idea. I won't go into the details of the clash that was called White and Red Armies, but the Red Army, whose leader was Leon Trotsky, did win. There were successes and there were failures in this experiment along the way. Joseph Stalin was technically an authoritarian, yet he joined the Western coalition to defeat the Nazi fascists in World War II, and his biggest personal priority was ending poverty in the U.S.S.R. He wanted to make certain that his country could also survive and compete in this growing world economy dominated by what are now called private capitalists. Neither Stalin's state planning model, which he called communist, or the private capitalist model in the West were successful in eliminating large-scale economic inequality. This means there wasn't much greater participation in the ownership of resources and wealth sharing. More on that later. There have been many other self-proclaimed socialists throughout modern history, and some who are very well known, so you might recognize them. Here are just a few: Albert Einstein, Oscar Wilde, Dr. Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, Emma Goldman, Eugene Victor Debs, Fidel Castro, Helen Keller, Theodore Dr. Seuss Geisel, Paul Robeson, Henry Wallace, Rosa Luxemburg, Malcolm X, and musicians John Lennon and Pete Seeger. They all played very important roles in our cultural and political history. In modern times, there are models of socialism mixed with capitalism in places like Scandinavia, Germany, France, Switzerland, essentially the European Union, also the UK, and of course the British Commonwealth countries, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, for instance. Though we have heard to the contrary in mainstream media, countries in South America, such as Venezuela and Iran in the Middle East, are hybrids as well. So is the United States. In the United States, there have been public programs such as the post office and the military on the federal level, and community park systems, libraries, kindergarten through 12th grade schools, fire and police departments, etc., on the state and local levels that are funded by tax dollars, so they all could be called forms of socialism. Besides Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders reiterating his lifelong interest in socialism, and especially with his 2019 speech about how democratic socialism can defeat oligarchy, the other notable success story was Kshana Sawant's two successful elections in 2013 and 2015 as the first socialist elected to the Seattle, Washington City Council since 1916. She's most known for running on raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour and seeing that get passed in the city of Seattle, followed by nationwide support. It became part of Bernie Sanders' 2016 presidential platform, it remains in his 2020 platform, and is also now part of mainstream discussion and approval. Socialism as capitalism is also defined as an economic system, and I'll get into that later. For this moment, I'm going to focus on analyzing a speech on the subject of democratic socialism. On June 12, 2019, independent senator from Vermont and 2016 and 2020 presidential candidate Bernie Sanders gave a landmark speech at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Even though the subject was supposedly about democratic socialism, it was focused most on the 20th century New Deal and a 21st century version of an economic Bill of Rights. This speech is extraordinarily important for many reasons. First of all, it is partly a history lesson going back to a time when economic and social inequality and injustices were in many ways similar to 2008 and after. He also points out differences as well as similarities in the political climate of the 1930s and now in the 21st century. Even though it was more of a history lesson than a political speech, it combined the two elements very effectively with an enthusiastic audience. When you hear Bernie on the campaign trail, you hear him quote alarming statistics. 3 families control more wealth than the bottom 50% of the population, which is about 160 million people in the U.S. The top 1% has more wealth than the bottom 92%, and 49% of all new income goes to the top 1%. He discusses how the New Deal, begun in the early 1930s, not only created economic relief for millions of Americans in a very short period of time after the huge stock market crash of 1929 followed by the Great Depression, but for a time it also helped to lessen the impact of a growing right-wing movement in the U.S. that was happening around the world in countries such as Germany and Italy. He pointed out a Nazi rally in the late 1930s where about 20,000 people gathered in Madison Square Garden in New York City. There was a poster of George Washington surrounded by swastikas prominently displayed. Bernie compared what was happening then to the growing right-wing politicians and movements around the world now, including President Donald Trump and the corporate ruling oligarchy here in the U.S. and around the world. For those of you who may not know what the New Deal was, Bernie Sanders covered the basics, which still exists from it, and how it came to be. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president in 1932. As a footnote, he was also the most popular U.S. president technically because he was the only one selected 4 times. As conditions worsened for millions of people in the early part of the Depression, what we would now call a progressive coalition came together and arranged a meeting with the president at the White House to address these serious concerns. I'll get into more details on this in a moment. Because of this meeting, FDR went to his party, the Democratic Party, and eventually all of Congress voted on proposals that he announced on the radio that we now know as the New Deal. A slim majority in Congress passed laws that included Social Security and unemployment insurance, which are hugely popular programs to this day. Job programs were created, putting at least 50 million people back to work in a very short period of time, with upgrading infrastructure, working in national parks, and even writers and actors wrote and read scripts in Broadway theaters in New York City. The Glass-Steagall Act effectively regulated Wall Street with the goal of stopping the creation of ultra-risky investments by investors such as the big banks, Chase Manhattan, the Bank of America, Citibank, and Wells Fargo. Of course, Chase Manhattan at the time was J.P. Morgan. By the way, all of these New Deal programs, being funded by public tax dollars, are also called a form of socialism. Sanders covered the basics, but of course we can elaborate with more historical details. When the Wall Street regulations over time were eventually eliminated with a series of bills passed from the Ronald Reagan to the Bill Clinton administrations, the banks once again freely created and traded risky stocks in the early 2000s, as they had done in the 1920s, and then the second largest stock market crash happened in 2008, when once again, millions of people lost homes, savings, and more. Another footnote, I would guess at least tens of millions of us would not be surprised that at least half of the U.S. American population now have little to no real economic recovery for over a decade. Sanders talked about how he is personally familiar with criticisms of socialism throughout his entire political career and how red baiting since FDR's era has been very common. He quotes President Harry Truman and of course Roosevelt defending themselves and essentially socialism, including the famous quote from FDR's 1936 speech where he addresses his critics by saying he welcomes their hatred. That quote was followed by one of Bernie's standing ovations from the audience, by the way. He also quotes 1928 Democratic presidential candidate Al Smith, who was a severe critic of FDR and the New Deal, and a Democrat, and even Ronald Reagan, who wrote a letter to Richard Nixon in 1960 stating that John Kennedy was comparable to, quote, old Karl Marx, end quote. He quoted Newt Gingrich and John Boehner from more recent times who warned of socialist spending programs and a new socialist experiment. Fast forward to the Trump administration, he even acknowledged that Donald Trump and oligarchs love corporate socialism, but they probably hate democratic socialism because democratic socialism is for the people and not them. He used examples going back and forth throughout history to the current day. Going back to the New Deal, he mentions that the Republican Party at that time, as well as conservatives in FDR's own party, yes, conservatives in the Democratic Party, which we would now call centrists, by the way, were opposed to the New Deal. He talked about how progressives in the Democratic Party and progressives outside of the party created a coalition that did become a slight majority so that the New Deal could pass in Congress. He didn't, of course, mention that those allies outside the Democratic Party were actually two socialist parties, the U.S. Communist Party, and unions they helped grow with at least 1 million members at that time. This was also the group that had the private meeting with FDR that I mentioned earlier. Sanders talked about his own political career and what he has fought and stood for decades. He goes on to say that democratic socialism to him at the core is about compassion, justice, and love. He finishes the speech going into how economic as well as social justice is about human rights, and that is what democratic socialism means to him. Then he finishes by tying the past with the present day again, and this time by mentioning FDR's 1944 speech, where he introduced what he called a second Bill of Rights. And though it didn't come to fruition in his administration because he passed away in 1945, it did set the stage for his wife Eleanor Roosevelt to introduce it to the United Nations. And they passed the 1948 resolution called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now Bernie Sanders is preparing what could be the epitome of what he calls democratic socialism, the 21st century economic Bill of Rights, guaranteeing basic necessities such as health care, housing, living wage jobs, assistance for those who have unfortunate circumstances, daycare for children, education, and more as human rights, as FDR had proposed. Finally, Bernie finished his speech saying, "Our goal together should be to finish the New Deal and establish a 21st century economic Bill of Rights." This is an extraordinarily important speech and needs to be understood so that we can indeed move on and work together to accomplish this. As I mentioned, we don't need to use these ism words if we don't want to. We can look at the ideas and the policies that have already been created, revise them, and create new ones as we learn to better understand how to change a dysfunctional system. This is about preparing for a transition to a new and better system and world, with more real democracy, which is a word that many people of all kinds of political perspectives often talk about. I also want to point out Bernie Sanders' final words in the second debate of the first two Democratic Party debates that took place on June 27, 2019. The final question to all candidates both nights was about what their first priority would be in their first administration. By the way, most of the talking points and even questions from the moderators at NBC were predominantly subjects that Bernie himself talked about in campaign speeches during the 2015-2016 primaries and since. There are widely popular issues with many voters who have been polled as well as progressives and now even to some extent in the Democratic Party establishment base. These issues include addressing climate change with the Green New Deal and energy system transition, Medicare for all or universal health care, reducing nuclear proliferation and ending interventionist wars, raising the minimum wage, and free college tuition. Bernie decided to focus on what the other candidates had not been during the debates, and here are his words. Quote, "I suspect people that are watching this debate are saying these are good people, have great ideas, but how come nothing really changes? How come for the last 45 years wages have been stagnant for the middle class? How come we have the highest rate of childhood poverty? How come 45 million people still have student loan debt? How come 3 people have more wealth than the bottom half of America?" And here's the answer. Nothing will change unless we have the guts to take on Wall Street, the insurance industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the military-industrial complex, and the fossil fuel industry. If we don't have the guts to take them on, we'll continue to have plans, we'll continue to have talk, the rich will get richer, and everyone else will be struggling, end quote. This isn't an official endorsement, and no one, including Bernie Sanders, is going to be perfect, but it is a fact. Millions of people know this. No other candidate in the 2020 presidential election has the overall experience, been on the right side of history, including with his voting record in Congress, has the future vision, enthusiasm, and attracts the largest attendances at rallies. This includes the impact with young generations and a growing number of all groups of people, including minorities of color and the LGBTQA+ community. One of Bernie Sanders' campaign surrogates, Professor Cornel West, is probably the best example of someone who understands the importance of a consistent legacy for decades and is quick to point out, even in mainstream media, how the centrists in the Democratic Party are too quick to jump on what will benefit them in the short term, even if there are issues that could technically be called examples of democratic socialism. He refers to the majority of candidates as being milquetoast politicians that can flip on positions without a real long-term passion and commitment to issues, regardless of number of years in service, while Bernie Sanders has been devoted to many of these issues his entire adult life. I must add that Socialist Seattle City Council member Shoshana Sawant is up for re-election again. The richest man in the U.S., Jeff Bezos, CEO of Amazon, and also Howard Schultz, who is the former CEO of Starbucks that have been headquartered in Seattle, are obviously not too happy with Sawant's success. Her proposed millionaire tax on Seattle's richest people, which of course includes them, as well as other policies proposed to benefit the working class, have prompted them and other wealthy elites to raise a lot of money for candidates to oppose her. Of course, socialism, as capitalism, is also about economics. A socialist economic system is characterized by social ownership and operation of the means of production that may take the form of autonomous cooperatives or direct public ownership, wherein production is carried out directly for use. Socialist economics has been associated with different schools of economic thought. This may be a boring subject for many of us. It certainly was for me in school. But since then, I have realized many things, particularly about economics. We do have a society with an economic system that has created the greatest inequality, including wealth inequality, since at least the 1920s. This is why there is more discussion about socialism and alternatives from history, as well as what exists in the present moment and how we can go forward. Many more realize how economics is also political, as social justice issues are, which is why we have political parties, elections, and governing bodies that we call government. We don't have to be limited to two parties that often just seem like one. We, the people, in fact, are the government. Our founding fathers didn't include the word democracy in the original documents, and we should know the history of how the United States actually was started as an imperialistic empire. All empires are imperialistic and controlled by a few. It was Abraham Lincoln who talked about democracy, really, when he said that we are a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Why aren't there more than two main political parties to include more ideas of more people and therefore more democracy? This is why many countries around the world have numerous parties, from green to socialist to communist to libertarian, and all kinds of variations in parliamentary systems. There are countries which have more socialism than the U.S. Capitalism still dominates in Scandinavia and Germany, for instance, but there's less wealth and income inequality than in the U.S. Something can be said about the importance of socialism in these examples alone. Economically, the workers don't have to be just employees working for employers and companies that have an outside board of directors who make all the most important decisions for companies. Workers can also be the owners of small or large enterprises. As worker owners, they can together decide what is being produced, how it is being produced, where and what to do with profits or surpluses after expenses are paid. With one person and one vote, I highly doubt the majority would vote to give CEOs 300 or more times the amount of salary as everyone else. Mondragon Cooperative Corporation in Spain has a worker cooperative with over 75,000 worker owners, voted to give its CEO no more than something like 10 times more than the average paid worker. The shared resources of people working together to help each other is a much more realistic goal than to continually put humans at odds against each other with more greed and inequality, creating wars, pollution, and greater inequality of all kinds around the whole world. Worker cooperatives, as any business model, also aren't perfect, but there's definitely more democracy and a better way to organize a business, a better way to distribute the wealth that is created together, and even more so, a better way to organize a society with a community-based structure that is more compassionate, caring, and equal. There is a better way than humans have been doing for hundreds of years now. Sustainability should be our much bigger goal going forward, just saving our own convenient individual lives. Are we going to create coalitions based on caring for each other and build cooperation as we work together? How about calling our next system a sustainable cooperative system? What can and must we all do next? The best way for me to answer that question is to leave you with Bernie Sanders himself from a rally that took place in Los Angeles in 2018. This is Dan Niswander. Thank you for watching and listening.
At the end of the day, it's not Bernie, it's you and you and you. You know, and I know, and everybody here knows, that real change never takes place from the top on down. It's not this person or that person. It is millions of people standing up, demanding change, and that's what we're about.
We have got to take a deep breath and understand something that we don't talk about very much as a nation. And that is, what are the economic rights of human beings? What are we entitled to as human beings? You know, way back in 1944, Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave a speech. And what he said is, you know, we got a lot of political freedoms in America, freedom of religion, freedom of to vote, freedom of assembly, and all that, the Bill of Rights. But what we don't have, this is back in 1944, are fundamental economic rights. And what this campaign is about is redefining what human rights are in America. So let me be as clear as I can be. In this country, it must be a human right for all of our people to have access to a decent paying job.